Captain Chen led Krasthul through the station's curved corridors, their footsteps creating distinct rhythms, her light human tread barely audible, his heavier, chitinous limbs producing sharp clicks against the polished floor. Other humans they passed attempted not to stare at the imposing alien warrior, but Krasthul noted their quickened pulse rates and dilated pupils. Fear responses. Appropriate. The diplomatic wing has been equipped with environmental adjustments for your comfort, Chen explained, gesturing to a series of rooms ahead. We've raised the ambient temperature and adjusted atmospheric composition based on Voth physiology profiles provided by your advanced team. Krasthul's translator rendered a formal acknowledgement, though privately he found the human consideration for his comfort puzzling. In hegemony protocols, accommodating the physiological needs of lesser species was unnecessary indulgence. Your species shows unexpected attention to diplomatic detail, he remarked. Chen's expression shifted slightly, what his cultural briefing had identified as a smile, though Krasthul found the baring of teeth distinctly unsettling. We've learned the importance of understanding those we meet, she replied. Sometimes the hard way. They entered a spacious chamber dominated by a circular table. Holographic displays activated as they approached, showing three-dimensional models of both Voth and human military vessels rotating slowly in comparison. As you can see, our technological capabilities are different, Chen acknowledged, gesturing to the obvious disparity between the sleek, crystalline Voth battlecruiser and a comparatively rudimentary human spacecraft. But we believe technology is only one factor in military assessment. Krasthul extended one clawed appendage toward the human vessel display, manipulating it to examine its primitive propulsion systems and limited weapons capability. Your species has achieved space travel remarkably quickly given your biological limitations. The Council recognizes potential when properly guided. Chen touched a control panel, and the display shifted to show historical progression of human weapons, from simple spears to increasingly sophisticated firearms, bombs, and finally, nuclear devices. We advance quickly when motivated, she said, particularly when it comes to finding new ways to fight. Krasthul's sensory ridges detected an unexpected undertone in her voice, not pride, but something his translator identified as wariness. Curious. The assessment protocol requires examination of combat history, technological progression, and psychological warfare readiness, he explained, settling his massive frame into a specially reinforced chair. The hegemony faces existential threats from the Swarm Collective. Proper evaluation of potential allies is essential. Chen nodded, taking the seat across from him. We understand completely. Earth has faced existential threats throughout our history, some external, many self-imposed. We're familiar with fighting for survival. She activated another display showing a timeline of human conflicts, their frequency and scale increasing dramatically in recent centuries. Krasthul's compound eyes widened slightly at the sheer number of distinct battle events. Your species fights. Often, he observed. Too often, Chen agreed with a grimness that surprised him. Which is why we value this opportunity for peaceful cooperation with the hegemony. We've learned much from our mistakes. A human attendant entered with refreshments, a protein supplement formulated for Voth digestive systems, and a steaming cup of what his olfactory sensors identified as a plant-derived stimulant for Chen. Tomorrow, we'll begin with first-hand accounts of our military history, Chen explained, sipping from her cup. I believe direct testimony provides better insight than technical reports. Krasthul inclined his head in what his cultural briefing indicated was a human gesture of agreement. The Voth value battle narratives as well. They preserve tactical wisdom and honor fallen warriors. We record our war stories for different reasons, Chen replied quietly. More as warnings than celebrations. This statement triggered Krasthul's first moment of genuine curiosity about humans. Why would a species record failures and suffering? The Voth historical archives contained only victories and successful strategies. Defeat was purged from memory as inefficient data. As their meeting concluded and Kraz Full retired to his quarters, he reviewed his initial observations. Humans, physically unimpressive, technologically limited, but behaviorally complex. Their diplomatic approach suggested either admirable confidence or dangerous self-delusion about their galactic standing. Either way, he anticipated completing his assessment efficiently. The preliminary report he transmitted to the hegemony that evening contained a single recommendation: provisional military value as auxiliary support units. Further evaluation will determine specific deployment suitability. He would later look back on that initial assessment with profound embarrassment. The education awaiting him would upend everything he thought he knew about warfare, courage, and the true meaning of combat strength. Kraz Full studied the holographic terrain model of the Western Front with growing confusion. The projection showed a scarred landscape stretching hundreds of kilometers, divided by two parallel trench systems, separated by a desolate strip designated as No Man's Land. "Your forces remained in these earthen fortifications for 4 years," he asked, mandibles clicking in disbelief. The Voth would never tolerate such strategic stagnation. Chen adjusted the display to show a cross-section of the trench system. The zigzagging design, the wooden reinforcements, the cramped dugouts where soldiers slept beneath the earth. Military commanders on both sides repeatedly attempted breakthroughs, she explained. Each offensive began with artillery bombardments lasting days or weeks. Millions of shells churned the battlefield to mud, destroying natural drainage and creating conditions where men could, and did, drown in craters. The hologram shifted to show soldiers standing in brown water that reached their knees, their expressions vacant as they huddled against trench walls. Many developed trench foot tissue death, similar to frostbite, but caused by constant wet conditions. Thousands lost limbs not to enemy fire, but to infections from these conditions. Kraz Full's compound eyes narrowed, his head tilting in the Voth expression of analytical interest. "Your commanders permitted this deterioration of combat assets. In hegemony forces, such wastage would result in immediate leadership replacement." Chen's lips pressed into a thin line. Military leadership was safely positioned kilometers behind the front lines. Many commanders never visited the trenches. This revelation caused Kraz Full's neck spines to rise involuntarily, a physiological response of outrage. Command detachment from combat conditions violated fundamental Voth military doctrine. Even the highest-ranking Voth generals led from the vanguard position. "How did your military maintain discipline under such conditions?" he asked. Chen activated another historical recording, this one showing a young soldier being tied to a wooden post. Some armies executed soldiers for cowardice if they refused to attack or attempted to flee. Others used military police positioned behind attacking waves with orders to shoot anyone retreating. The concept bewildered Kraz Full. Your own species fired upon its warriors. This contradicts efficient force preservation. Efficiency wasn't the primary concern, Chen replied, her voice softening. The conflict had become as much about national will as territorial gains. Neither side could afford to show weakness. The hologram shifted again, showing soldiers climbing over trench parapets with fixed bayonets, running across open ground toward machine gun positions. Rows of men fell in waves, yet those behind continued forward, stepping over their fallen comrades. The mathematics of attrition were brutal, Chen continued. Machine guns could fire hundreds of rounds per minute across fixed firing lanes. Attacking forces often knew their chances of survival were minimal, yet millions still went over the top when ordered. Kraz Full's translator struggled with the concept. For what strategic objective? Often just a few hundred meters of devastated terrain that would be lost in the next counterattack, Chen answered. At Passchendaele, British forces suffered 310,000 casualties to gain 5 miles of ground. It was later abandoned. The hologram displayed a new scene. 2 opposing trenches during a winter period, where soldiers from opposing sides met in the middle of no man's land, exchanging small items and playing an impromptu ball game together. The Christmas truce of 1914, Chen explained. For a brief moment, common humanity overcame national divisions. Commanders on both sides ensured it never happened again. Krasful fell silent, his exoskeleton plates shifting slightly as he processed this information. The Voth understood warfare as a decisive means to clear territorial objectives. The concept of prolonged, indecisive combat with astronomical casualty rates for minimal gains contradicted all logical military doctrine. "There is something I fail to understand," he finally said. "Your historical archives preserve these failures. The Voth purge records of inefficient campaigns to prevent tactical contamination. Why maintain these memories?" Chen studied him carefully before answering. "Because forgetting leads to repetition, Commander. We preserve our darkest moments to ensure we recognize their approach if we see them again." She guided him toward the chamber's exit, past display cases containing personal items recovered from the trenches, a mud-caked pocket watch, letters sealed in protective cases, a harmonica with bullet damage. "Tomorrow we'll discuss how this conflict, despite its scale, served merely as prelude to an even larger war that followed 2 decades later," she said. "One that introduced entirely new dimensions of combat." That night, in his quarters, Krasful found himself unable to enter the Voth regenerative state. His mind kept returning to the image of humans living in mud-filled ditches year after year, and the puzzling contradiction of soldiers who fraternized with enemies one day and attempted to kill them the next. For the first time in his long military career, he encountered warfare that defied rational analysis. Krasful's breathing apparatus clicked softly as he absorbed the images of human cities transformed into wastelands. His clawed hand hovered over the display controls, rewinding the footage of Dresden before and after the firebombing raids. "Explain again the strategic value of this urban center," he requested, voice modulator pitched lower than usual. "Dresden was a transportation hub with some military significance," Chen replied. "But historians debate whether the extensive bombing was strategically necessary or partially motivated by retribution." "Retribution," Krasful repeated, the translator struggling with the concept. "You mean vengeance, a psychological rather than tactical motivation." "Yes." After years of witnessing their own cities bombed, Allied forces showed decreasing restraint toward German population centers. The display shifted to aerial photographs of Tokyo, where firebombing had created storm-like infernos that consumed entire districts. Heat so intense it boiled canals. People who jumped into rivers to escape the flames, only to cook in the superheated water. "Your species inflicted this level of destruction using chemical incendiaries rather than fusion weapons?" Krasful asked, his sensory ridges flattening against his skull, a physical manifestation of distress rarely displayed by Voth warriors. "We hadn't developed nuclear weapons yet," Chen clarified. "These were conventional bombing raids using incendiary devices specifically designed to create firestorms in densely populated areas." The methodical efficiency with which humans had approached the science of urban destruction disturbed Krasful more than the destruction itself. War machines targeting military installations was rational. Developing precise methodologies to incinerate civilian population centers suggested a calculated ruthlessness that exceeded even hegemony extinction protocols. These bombing strategies, he noted, they appear designed to break civilian morale rather than achieve military objectives. Chen nodded. Strategic bombing theorists believe targeting civilian populations would shorten wars by breaking national will to fight. Reality proved more complex. Often these attacks strengthened resolve and triggered escalating retaliation. The display shifted again to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, before, during, and after the atomic detonations. Krasful watched in silence as single devices instantaneously transformed living cities into charred wastelands. The thermal flash, the pressure wave, the black rain. "A single delivery vehicle," he murmured. "One device, one pilot." "Yes," Chen confirmed. "A paradigm shift in destructive efficiency." Krasful's compound eyes fixed on the radiation victims, Humans whose skin sloughed off in sheets, whose hair fell out in clumps, who died slowly over weeks rather than in the initial blast. And yet, he observed, these cities stand rebuilt today. I reviewed the geographic data before arrival. New structures rise where these weapons detonated. Humans rebuild, Chen said simply. It's perhaps our most consistent trait. Krasful turned away from the displays, his exoskeleton shifting uncomfortably. In 3 centuries of military service, he had participated in campaigns that devastated planetary ecosystems and extinguished resistant populations. Yet something about the human approach to warfare disturbed him on a fundamental level. The VOF utilize overwhelming force to achieve rapid capitulation, he explained. Clean, precise, minimal suffering through maximal initial impact. Your species appears to have developed methodologies specifically designed to prolong suffering. Chen's expression remained neutral. We didn't set out to optimize for suffering, Commander. These weapons evolved through escalating cycles of attack and defense. When conventional bombing proved insufficient, we developed incendiaries. When those weren't enough, we split the atom. She guided him toward another section of the exhibition, this one displaying the Cold War arsenals of the major human powers. Thousands of nuclear warheads, each many times more powerful than those used on Japan. For nearly 50 years, human civilization existed knowing these weapons could launch with minimal warning, she explained. Children practiced hiding under desks. Families built backyard bunkers. Governments constructed evacuation plans they knew would fail. Krasful's translator caught the subtle irony in her voice. You doubt the efficacy of these survival measures. The scenarios projected complete societal collapse, Chen replied. The preparation was psychological as much as practical. It gave people the illusion of control in an uncontrollable situation. She activated a final display, a simple graph showing the exponential growth of human destructive capability over a mere century. From biplanes dropping hand grenades to intercontinental missiles carrying multiple warheads in less than one human lifetime, she noted. No other technology in our history has evolved so rapidly. Krasful stared at the progression curve, his military mind calculating the implications. Your current capabilities must be, he began. Classified, Chen interjected smoothly. But you understand the trajectory. As they exited the exhibition chamber, Krasful found himself walking closer to the wall than necessary, a subtle defensive posture his combat training identified immediately. He was experiencing something unprecedented in his military career, instinctive caution in the presence of a supposedly inferior species. The meeting room felt unnervingly intimate after the grand historical displays of previous days. Krasful found himself seated at a circular table with 5 human veterans spanning different eras of warfare. Captain Chen had introduced them simply by name and conflict before stepping back to observe. An elderly man named James, his fingers gnarled with age, spoke of the Normandy landings with startling clarity despite the decades that had passed. The ramp dropped and the sea was red with blood, he recounted, eyes focused on something distant. My best friend took a bullet to the throat before his boots touched French soil. I had to step over him to move forward. There was no choice but forward. Krasful's translator captured the flat tone and matter-of-fact delivery, but struggled with the emotional undercurrents. VOF battlefield recordings emphasized tactical precision and victory. This human spoke of chaos, fear, and an emotion the translator approximated as heartbreak. You advanced despite knowing the statistical probability of your demise, Krasful inquired. James looked at him directly. We didn't need statistics to know many of us would die. We could see it happening. But stopping wasn't an option. A middle-aged woman named Fatima spoke next, describing urban combat in Fallujah. Her right leg ended mid-thigh, replaced by an articulated prosthetic. House-to-house fighting is intimate, she explained. You clear rooms where families had dinner the week before. You step over children's toys to secure positions. Sometimes you can't tell combatants from civilians until they're shooting at you, or you've shot them. Krasful's head tilted in the Voth expression of confusion. The hegemony creates clear delineation between combat and civilian zones before engagement. This mixture seems inefficient. War isn't efficient, Fatima replied with a slight edge to her voice. It's messy, dirty, and rarely follows anyone's plans. The youngest veteran, Marcus, spoke of piloting remote drones, flying combat missions from secured facilities thousands of kilometers from the target zone. I would fire missiles at coordinates, watch people die on my screen, then drive home and have dinner with my family, he explained, his artificial eyes glowing faintly as their servo mechanisms adjusted focus. The psychological disconnect created its own kind of trauma. We called it the God complex, followed by the God's remorse. Krasful found this concept particularly alien. Voth warriors valued direct combat as the purest expression of military virtue. Remote warfare seemed simultaneously advanced and primitive. You experience psychological damage despite physical safety, he asked. Marcus nodded. The human mind wasn't designed to kill at a distance without personal risk. It breaks something in you. The oldest veteran in the room had remained silent until now. Chen had introduced him as Samuel, a veteran of something called the Vietnam conflict. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravelly weight that the translator identified as authority earned through suffering. The thing none of our historical records properly capture, Samuel said, is the smell. Combat has a smell that never leaves your memory. Blood, excrement, burning flesh, cordite, fear. Your own fear has a smell, Commander. Krasful's olfactory receptors flared involuntarily. The Voth possessed superior smell capabilities to humans, and battlefield scent markers played an important role in their tactical assessments. This sensory aspect is significant to human warriors, he inquired. Samuel nodded slowly. The physical senses burn the experience into parts of your brain that don't respond to logical thought. Decades later, a certain smell, a particular sound, and suddenly you're not here anymore. You're back there. We call these triggers. The fifth veteran, introduced only as May, had remained completely silent, her hands folded neatly on the table. When attention turned to her, she simply slid across the table a small worn photograph showing children in a village. I was Special Forces, she said quietly. Some missions were classified beyond top secret. This village no longer exists, nor do most of its inhabitants. I can tell you nothing more except that I still see their faces every night when I close my eyes. The room fell into silence that stretched uncomfortably. Krasful noted the profound difference between this intimate recounting and the formal battle testimonials recorded by Voth warriors after successful campaigns. You all speak of lasting harm, he finally observed. Yet you volunteered to revisit these experiences today. Why? James, the Normandy veteran, answered for the group. Because understanding has value. Because memory prevents repetition. Because what happened to us matters. Captain Chen stepped forward then. There's something else these veterans share, Commander. Can you identify it? Krasful studied the 5 humans carefully, searching for the common factor. They spanned different ages, genders, conflicts, and forms of service. They all survived, he ventured. No, Chen corrected gently. They all still serve. James counsels new veterans. Fatima designs prosthetics. Marcus develops PTSD treatments. Samuel works with refugee children. Mai prevents veteran suicides. She placed a hand on Krasful's armored shoulder, a gesture of unprecedented familiarity that he found himself permitting. This is how humans process warfare, Commander. Not just by fighting, but by healing afterward. Captain Chen led Krasful through a corridor lined with primitive weapons mounted on display. Simple rifles, homemade explosives, and modified agricultural tools. Each item bore a small plaque detailing its origin and historical context. These represent asymmetric warfare implements from various resistance movements, she explained. Unlike conventional military equipment, these weapons were often created by civilians using available materials. Krasful examined a bicycle modified to conceal explosives in its frame. This seems inefficient compared to proper military armaments. That's precisely the point, Chen replied. When facing enemies with technological superiority, humans adapt using creativity rather than matching force directly. They entered a room where an elderly historian waited beside a three-dimensional tactical display. The man introduced himself as Professor Nguyen, a specialist in guerrilla warfare history. The Vietnamese conflict offers perhaps the clearest example of effective asymmetric response to technological advantage. The professor began, activating the display to show dense jungle terrain. American forces possessed air superiority, artillery dominance, and vastly superior firepower. Yet they ultimately withdrew without achieving their strategic objectives. The display showed a network of tunnels beneath the jungle floor, narrow passages barely wide enough for a human to crawl through, extending for hundreds of kilometers. The Q-Chi tunnel network represented adaptation to overwhelming firepower, Nguyen explained. When American B-52 bombers carpet-bombed an area, Vietnamese fighters simply went underground, emerging after the bombing stopped to continue resistance. Krasful studied the diagram with growing discomfort. The Voth military doctrine relied heavily on sensor-guided precision strikes to eliminate command nodes. An enemy that dispersed leadership and operated without centralized command challenged fundamental hegemony tactical assumptions. These tunnel networks appear vulnerable to simple counters, he noted. Gas weapons, flooding, all attempted, Chen interjected. The tunnels included air filtration systems, water seals, and multiple escape routes. When one section was compromised, others remained operational. Professor Nguyen adjusted the display to show booby traps, simple but lethal devices constructed from scavenged materials. Punji stakes coated with excrement caused infections resistant to field treatment, he explained clinically. Tripwires activated repurposed artillery shells. Even discarded ration cans were transformed into explosive devices. Krasful's mandibles clicked rapidly, a physiological sign of cognitive strain. Your species weaponizes waste materials. This contradicts efficient resource allocation principles. Necessity drives innovation, Nguyen replied. When conventional weapons are unavailable, anything becomes a potential weapon. The display shifted again, showing timeline comparisons of various insurgencies and resistance movements. The American Revolution, the Soviet-Afghan conflict, anti-colonial struggles in Africa and Asia. Each showed the same pattern. Technologically superior forces ultimately withdrawing despite overwhelming combat advantages. The consistent factor, Chen noted, is asymmetry of motivation. Occupying forces fight for strategic objectives. Indigenous defenders fight for survival and identity. She gestured to a chart showing casualty tolerance rates. An invading force typically withdraws after sustaining casualties representing a small percentage of their total strength. Defending populations often endure casualty rates exceeding 20% of their total population. Krasful stared at the projection, his compound eyes reflecting the statistical displays. Your species accepts civilian casualty rates that would trigger automatic protocol revaluation in hegemony engagement parameters. When survival of culture and identity is at stake, Nguyen said quietly, humans demonstrate remarkable tolerance for suffering. The final display showed what appeared to be primitive communication devices, handwritten notes, simple radio transmitters, and message drops. Perhaps most challenging for conventional military forces, Chen explained, is the human capacity to maintain operational security using minimal technology. When advanced communication networks are compromised, resistance movements simply revert to pre-technological methods. She played a recording of seemingly innocuous radio broadcasts, weather reports, poetry readings, and musical interludes. During World War II, resistance networks transmitted coded messages hidden within public broadcasts. The sentence, "The yellow cat sleeps at midnight," might trigger a sabotage operation hundreds of kilometers away. Krasful's exoskeleton vibrated slightly. and involuntary stress response. This represents a security challenge that exceeds standard hegemony containment protocols. That's the fundamental nature of human resistance, Chen confirmed. When conventional defenses fail, we become radically decentralized, virtually impossible to fully suppress. She deactivated the displays, the room falling into shadow that highlighted the alien commander's bioluminescent markings. The Voth military philosophy centers on overwhelming force to achieve rapid capitulation, she observed. But humans have repeatedly demonstrated that force alone rarely achieves lasting victory. When we cannot match an enemy's strength, we exploit their weaknesses through patience, adaptation, and willingness to endure. As they exited the room, Krasthul found himself instinctively scanning the corridor for hidden compartments and improvised weapons, a combat reflex triggered only in the most dangerous operational environments. "Commander," Chen said, noticing his heightened alert status, "you've had 5 days of historical briefings. Tomorrow we shift to theoretical scenarios, how Earth might respond to hypothetical threats from beyond our atmosphere." Something in her tone caused Krasthul's secondary heart to accelerate its pumping cycle, a physiological preparation for imminent combat that no human could have detected. The simulation chamber hummed with energy as holographic projections materialized around them. Krasthul found himself surrounded by a three-dimensional model of Earth's solar system, planets rotating slowly around the central star. Captain Chen stood beside a control console, her expression more formal than in previous sessions. "Commander, today we address theoretical defensive scenarios," she began. "Specifically, how Earth might respond to various categories of extraterrestrial incursion." With a gesture, she collapsed the solar system model and expanded Earth to fill the projection space. The blue planet rotated slowly, cloud patterns shifting across its surface as various defense installations illuminated orbital platforms, ground-based launch facilities, and subterranean command centers. Since the mid-20th century, human military strategists have developed contingencies for extraterrestrial contact scenarios, ranging from peaceful exchange to full planetary invasion. Chen explained, "These simulations represent our current theoretical response framework." She activated the first scenario. A small fleet of alien vessels appeared in Earth orbit, sleek craft that bore unsettling similarities to hegemony scout ships. Scenario Alpha, limited incursion with targeted objectives, Chen narrated as the simulation unfolded. An extraterrestrial force seeking specific resources or geographic control rather than full planetary conquest. The response began with diplomatic overtures, followed by escalating military postures when diplomacy failed. Krasthul watched with growing unease as human forces demonstrated unexpected tactical flexibility, sacrificing space-based assets to draw enemy ships into prepared killing zones, using atmospheric conditions to degrade sensor capabilities, and deploying decentralized command structures to prevent decapitation strikes. "Your species practices deliberate technology sacrifice?" he asked, mandibles clicking rapidly. "This contradicts efficiency parameters. We call it honeypot strategy," Chen replied, offering tempting targets that, when engaged, expose the attacker to greater risk. The simulation shifted to a second scenario, a massive invasion fleet entering the solar system, clearly intent on full planetary occupation. Scenario Omega. Existential threat with overwhelming force disparity, Chen continued, her voice maintaining professional detachment despite the apocalyptic images unfolding before them. This response began differently. Rather than conventional military engagement, the simulation showed Earth's population dispersing into prepared sanctuary zones, underground complexes, remote mountain redoubts, and submarine habitats. Military assets broke into autonomous cells operating without centralized command. Without a centralized leadership structure, how do these units coordinate? Krasthul inquired, professional curiosity temporarily overriding his growing discomfort. Pre-established protocols and mission-type orders, Chen explained. Each unit commander understands the strategic objective, but retains tactical flexibility for implementation. We call it Commander's Intent Doctrine. The simulation progressed to show the occupation phase. As alien forces secured major population centers, they encountered a planet that seemed to actively resist them. Industrial facilities self-destructed rather than falling intact to invaders. Infrastructure systems initiated cascading failures when tampered with. Water reservoirs became contaminated through automated release mechanisms. Your species has prepared self-sabotage protocols. Krasful asked, his translator struggling to convey his mixture of horror and reluctant admiration. We call it denial of assets strategy, Chen confirmed. If we cannot defend a resource, we ensure its capture provides no advantage to an occupying force. The simulation's final phase showed the long-term occupation timeline. Human resistance never ceased but transformed. From initial military engagements to dispersed guerrilla operations, then to cultural preservation activities and passive non-compliance campaigns. Children born during occupation were educated in hidden schools that preserve human history and identity while appearing to comply with occupier mandates. Most concerning to potential invaders, Chen noted as the timeline extended decades into the future, is our species' generational resilience. Historical evidence demonstrates that human resistance movements typically grow stronger in the second and third generations under occupation. She deactivated the simulation, the room dimming to normal lighting levels. Krasful realized his breathing apparatus had accelerated to combat readiness rates without conscious control. There is a final protocol, Chen said quietly, activating one last simulation. The display showed Earth's surface erupting in sequential detonations, thousands of nuclear devices triggering simultaneously at key geological fault lines, within ocean depths, and at strategic resource locations. The simulation ended with a planet rendered uninhabitable, not just to human life, but to most complex biological organisms. Protocol Terminus, Chen stated simply. If faced with an invader capable of exploiting Earth's biosphere for objectives that threaten the broader galaxy, we maintain the capacity to ensure they inherit nothing but ash. She deactivated the display and turned to face Krasful directly. Some on your Hegemony Council might interpret these preparations as evidence of paranoia or aggression. We prefer to consider it prudent insurance against worst-case scenarios. Krasful remained silent, his compound eyes fixed on the empty space where Earth's self-immolation had played out moments before. The casual way Chen had displayed her species' willingness to destroy their own world rather than surrender its resources contradicted everything the hegemony understood about rational species behavior. You've shown me enough, he finally managed, his translator failing to fully mask the strain in his voice. I require time to process these theoretical scenarios. Krasful's quarters had been transformed during his absence. Where sparse military functionality had prevailed, the room now contained shelves lined with physical books, walls adorned with art reproductions, and a sound system softly playing orchestral music. Captain Chen had granted his request for access to human cultural archives with unexpected thoroughness. For 3 days, he had immersed himself in human creative expression. Literature spanning centuries, music from diverse traditions, art from countless movements. He had requested additional materials repeatedly, consuming information at a pace that seemed to surprise his human hosts. Now, surrounded by these artifacts, Krasful sat in contemplative stillness, his exoskeleton shifting through subtle color modulations that reflected deep cognitive processing. On the table before him lay open books, Tolstoy's War and Peace, Sun Tzu's Art of War, poetry by Wilfred Owen, and philosophical works by Camus and Frankl. A gentle chime announced Captain Chen's arrival. She entered carrying a small wooden box, her expression curious but patient. You've been quite thorough in your cultural studies, Commander, she observed, glancing at his extensive notes. May I ask what you're seeking? Krasful's compound eyes shifted focus, the bioluminescent patterns across his carapace settling into a more formal configuration. Understanding, he replied simply. Your warfare patterns defied rational analysis. I hypothesize that your cultural expressions might provide contextual frameworks your military briefings lacked. Chen nodded, setting the wooden box on the table. And have you found what you were looking for? Not answers, Krasful admitted. More questions, but perhaps more useful questions. He gestured to the art reproductions. Picasso's Guernica beside Goya's Disasters of War, Renaissance masterpieces alongside indigenous carvings. Your species creates beauty while surrounded by self-inflicted horror, he observed. You write poetry about your most devastating conflicts. You compose music in concentration camps. You paint transcendent visions while cities burn around you. His translator struggled to convey the complexity of his tone, a mixture of confusion and reluctant admiration. These contradictions initially appeared as data anomalies, he continued, cognitive inconsistencies to be resolved. Now I recognize they represent your species' defining characteristic. Chen sat across from him, her posture relaxed yet attentive. And what characteristic is that? Duality, Krasful replied. The capacity to simultaneously hold contradictory truths. You create weapons of unprecedented destructive capacity while establishing organizations dedicated to peace. You train warriors to kill efficiently while developing elaborate medical systems to heal. You prepare for apocalypse while planting trees that will not mature in your lifetime. He lifted a volume of poetry written by combat veterans. Your warriors express trauma through creative works rather than glory narratives. This contradicts all Voth military psychological conditioning. Chen opened the wooden box she had brought, revealing a small bonsai tree, a miniature pine perhaps a century old, perfectly formed despite its confined space. This represents another apparent contradiction, she explained. Constraint as a path to beauty. Limitation fostering creativity rather than diminishing it. Krastul studied the tiny tree with his sensory appendages. You cultivate controlled hardship. We recognize that struggle often precedes growth, Chen confirmed, both for plants and civilizations. She gestured around at the cultural artifacts filling the room. You've been studying our art, literature, and philosophy. May I ask what specific insights you've gained about human warfare? Krasthul's breathing apparatus cycled several times before he answered, a Voth indication of significant thought. Your most profound military strength isn't technological or tactical, he finally stated. It's metaphysical. Your species fights most effectively not for resources or territory, but for abstract concepts. Freedom, justice, identity, future generations. His carapace shifted to display formal academic patterns, the equivalent of citations in Voth scholarly discourse. Your Viktor Frankl survived extermination camps by finding meaning in suffering. Your Václav Havel defeated a totalitarian regime using philosophical essays and theatrical performances. Your Gandhi conquered an empire without weapons. Chen smiled slightly. You've been thorough in your research. Out of necessity, Krasful admitted. The hegemony classifies species based on technological advancement and resource allocation efficiency. We have no classification framework for a species that creates art amid apocalypse or finds strength in vulnerability. He gestured to a reproduction of the Earth rising over the lunar horizon, the famous photograph taken by Apollo astronauts. This image represents your most perplexing characteristic, he said. You travel to your moon primarily to demonstrate technological superiority during a period of geopolitical conflict. Yet once there, your astronauts turned their recording devices back toward their homeworld and created poetry, beauty, reflection. Chen nodded. The overview effect. Seeing Earth from space often transforms perspective. Transformation through perspective shift. Krasful repeated, the concept clearly resonating with his current experience, perhaps the most dangerous human capability of all. The hegemony diplomatic vessel gleamed against the blackness of space as it prepared for departure. Inside the ship's secure communication chamber, Krasful finalized his assessment report. His exoskeleton had settled into the formal patterning of highest ceremonial significance, bioluminescent markings indicating content of exceptional importance to the collective. The report's classification required genetic verification beyond standard protocols. Even among the hegemony's ruling council, access would be restricted to the inner circle. Krasfol's appendages moved with deliberate precision across the interface as he applied the final encryption layers. A soft chime indicated Captain Chen's arrival for the formal departure ceremony. He sealed the transmission with his genetic signature before turning to greet her. "Your report is complete," she inquired politely, though something in her expression suggested she already knew its contents. "Yes," Krasfol confirmed, "though I doubt it will be what the council anticipated." Chen nodded, offering him a small wooden box similar to the one that had contained the bonsai tree. "A departure gift, a token of our time together." Krasfol accepted it with formal grace, his sensory appendages detecting something unexpected within. Not organic material, but something metallic with trace radiation signatures. "Our custom is to exchange gifts at the conclusion of significant diplomatic engagements," Chen explained as they walked toward the departure bay. "May I ask what conclusions you've reached about Earth's potential relationship with the hegemony?" Krasfol considered his response carefully. Diplomatic protocol prohibited sharing classified assessment details, yet something in this human's demeanor suggested extraordinary perception. "I have recommended a significant recalibration of hegemony engagement parameters," he answered, choosing each word with precision. "Previous classification metrics have proven inadequate." Chen smiled slightly. "That sounds rather diplomatic, Commander." They reached the shuttle bay where a formal honor guard awaited, both human military personnel and Krasfol's Voth security detail standing in precise formation. The ceremonial protocols would normally proceed with ritualized efficiency, but Krasfol paused, his compound eyes studying Earth visible through the viewports. "Your world appears deceptively fragile from orbit," he observed. "Blue, vulnerable, isolated. Yet having studied your history, I now see something very different." "And what do you see?" Chen asked quietly. "A crucible," Krasfol replied. "Every human carries the legacy of survivors, those who endured ice ages with stone tools, plagues without medicine, and warfare of escalating destructive capacity. Natural selection operating not just on physical attributes, but on psychological resilience." He turned to face her directly, his translator calibrated to maximum nuance. "The hegemony has encountered many species capable of violence. That alone is unremarkable. What makes humans unique is not your capacity for destruction, but your ability to witness apocalypse and still create beauty afterward." Chen nodded, seemingly unsurprised by his assessment. "We call it hope, Commander. The capacity to envision a better future despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. A dangerous evolutionary adaptation," Krasfol noted. "It makes your species nearly impossible to permanently subjugate." The formal departure announcement echoed through the bay, signaling the final boarding call. Krasfol's security detail moved toward the shuttle with practiced precision. "There is something I must ask before departing," he said, lowering his voice to prevent others from hearing. "This diplomatic exchange, was it truly an assessment of Earth's military capabilities by the hegemony, or was Earth assessing the hegemony through me?" Chen's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in her eyes. Perhaps both simultaneously. Another example of human duality. Krasfol's mandibles clicked in what his species recognized as reluctant admiration. "I have recommended that the hegemony approach Earth with exceptional caution and respect. Not because we fear your current technological capabilities, but because we recognize your potential trajectory." "A wise recommendation," Chen replied. "We hope for peaceful cooperation, but history has taught us to prepare for all eventualities." As Krasfol boarded the shuttle, he finally opened the small wooden box Chen had given him. Inside lay not a cultural artifact as expected, but a data crystal of Voth manufacture, one containing hegemony military protocols, that no human should have been able to access. With it was a simple handwritten note. We look forward to a relationship of mutual respect rather than mutual deception. Your classified report was quite insightful, particularly the sections you believed were encrypted. Safe journey, Commander. As the shuttle disengaged and accelerated toward the waiting hegemony vessel, Krasful experienced an emotion rarely felt by his species, genuine humility, mixed with profound relief that his recommendation for peaceful engagement had been sincere. In his personal quarters, the final words of his report awaited transmission. The species we have encountered represents not merely a potential ally against the Swarm Collective, but a fundamental challenge to hegemony assumptions about civilizational development. Their capacity for both self-destruction and transcendent creativity makes them uniquely valuable and potentially the most dangerous species we have yet encountered. Approach with utmost caution and authentic respect.